Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're immersing ourselves in a campaign from World War I that, well, even a century later, it still serves as this raw nerve and a national genesis story all at once. We are, of course, diving into the Gallipoli campaign fought between April 1915 and January 1916.
And it's really one of the most consequential strategic failures of the Great War. But our sources immediately highlight its core paradox.
Right.
For the major Allied powers, Britain and France, it was a military disaster, an absolute catastrophe.
Right.
But for the defending Ottoman forces, it was a pivotal foundational victory, one that directly paved the way for modern Turkey.
And that is a mission for this deep dive. We're going to use your source material to try and cut through some of the mythology and understand the sheer, almost unbelievable ambition of the Entente's initial goals.
Exactly, and the specific tactical reasons behind the Ottoman success. And I think most importantly, how this single battlefield fundamentally shaped the national identities of three separate nations: Turkey, Australia, and New Zealand.
It's so much to unpack.
It is. We're dealing with a complex mix of grand strategy, logistical nightmares, and profound cultural consequences. So it requires us to really think critically to synthesize the immediate military outcome with that long-term political and social resonance.
We're not just looking at the fighting on the beaches.
Not at all. We're analyzing why those months of struggle continue to define political landscapes even today.
Okay, so let's unpack those initial aims, because if you look at the plan, especially the one conceived in London, the goals were audacious.
Audacious is a good word for it. They weren't seeking a local victory, they were looking for a silver bullet, a maneuver that could fundamentally shorten the war.
So what exactly were the Anglo-French forces hoping to achieve by invading the Ottoman heartland?
The goals were massive, and they were all highly interconnected. They were essentially trying to bypass the bloody stalemate of the Western Front.
Right, get around it.
We can break it down into four main strategic aims. First and most immediate, force the Dardanelles Straits. This narrow, heavily defended waterway was the only gateway to the Black Sea.
And to the Ottoman capital.
Exactly. So if you force the straits, the second goal follows naturally, which is to capture the capital, Istanbul itself.
Which was seen as a war-winning objective.
Precisely. Capturing Istanbul wasn't just about taking the political and spiritual heart of the Ottoman Empire. It would also achieve the third critical aim: reopening a secure, reliable sea route to their eastern ally, Russia.
And Russia was at this point bleeding heavily on the Eastern Front and desperately needed arms and supplies.
They were. And the ability to supply Russia through a warm water port, bypassing German and Austrian control, it was deemed absolutely crucial for keeping them in the fight.
So that's three. What was the fourth, the biggest one?
The fourth was the ultimate prize: to knock the Ottoman Empire entirely out of the war.
Given the immense risk, the resources required, how certain are we from the sources that this was a realistic goal and not just, a desirable bonus?
Oh, the sources confirm it was absolutely central to the planning. Planners like Winston Churchill really believed the Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe.
Right, that old phrase.
They thought it was politically fragile, that a swift, hard blow to the capital would cause the whole thing to collapse. The desired ripple effects were enormous relief pressure on Russia, maybe encourage neutral Balkan states like Greece or Bulgaria to join the Entente.
And shorten the entire conflict.
At the end of the day, that was it. By taking out a key central power, you shorten the entire war. The stakes, from their perspective, could not have been higher.
So if the goals were that grand, they started off, well, a bit tentatively, right? The initial plan wasn't even a ground war.
That's right. It was a spectacular naval failure first. The planners, very confident in their technological and naval superiority, they decided the first major attempt would be purely naval. This was in March 1915.
So the idea was just to sail a massive fleet through the Dardanelles?
Essentially, yes. They assumed a huge armada of the latest battleships could simply sweep through and intimidate Istanbul into submission.
And that naval effort immediately hit a massive roadblock. What defenses did the Ottomans have that proved so devastating?
It wasn't just one thing. It was a layered defense, and it was well prepared. The sources show the Ottomans, with German advice, had fortified the straits intensely with powerful coastal artillery. But the real killer,
the mines,
the extensive carefully laid minefields. In that March naval attempt, several Allied capital ships were either sunk or severely damaged. We're talking French and British battleships.
And that single naval failure was the pivot point, wasn't it?
It was the moment everything changed. That defeat convinced the Allied planners that naval power alone wasn't going to be enough.
So they realized the only way to get rid of the coastal guns in the minefields
was to land troops, take the high ground, and destroy those defenses from the landward side. That failure in March 1915 is what irrevocably set the stage for the ground war.
And here is where the operation moves from a strategic gambit to a horrifying physical reality. The pivotal day for the ground war was April 25th, 1915.
Yes, this is where those names we all know, Cape Helles, ANZAC Cove, enter the global conversation.
And the landings were supposed to be a rapid, decisive push.
They were, but the plan immediately disintegrated. The troops faced the logistical nightmare from the second they hit the sand. We have to remember the environment here. This wasn't Flanders fields.
No.
This was rugged, rocky scrubland, filled with sheer ravines, which the Allies had very poorly scouted.
An immediate advantage for the defenders, then.
A huge one. That combination of difficult terrain, fierce Ottoman resistance, and frankly, significant planning and command failures on the Allied side meant that what was supposed to be a quick breakout
just evolved into trench warfare.
Instantly. They were essentially trapped on these narrow, tightly held beachheads almost from the first day.
That shifts the entire focus onto the defenders. We hear so much about the courage of the troops who landed, but the effectiveness of the Ottoman defense is often glossed over.
It is, and it was key. The strength of the defense lay in combining these effective pre-built layered defenses with highly decisive leadership.
So it wasn't just German officers running the show.
No. While they did benefit from German technical advice, the command was largely and effectively exercised by Ottoman generals. They used the high ground overlooking the landing areas perfectly,
which let them fire down on the vulnerable beachheads
and contain the invasion. And critically, we can't discuss the Ottoman defense without discussing one figure whose actions that day became legendary.
Mustafa Kemal.
His role here was career-defining, and you could argue, nation-defining. The sources really highlight his decisive, timely counter-moves on the strategic heights above ANZAC Cove.
Specifically at a place called Chunuk Bair.
Yes, he recognized the threat, famously ordered his troops to hold their positions no matter the cost, and he prevented a critical Allied breakout.
And if the Allies had managed to seize those heights,
they could have cut the peninsula in half. The whole Ottoman position would have become untenable.
So his intervention was that crucial.
It was. And that action wasn't just a military success. It became central to the later Turkish national narrative of the battle, the ultimate symbol of resilience. It directly fed into his meteoric political rise as, the future founder of the Republic of Turkey.
That really deepens the context. So looking back, it wasn't just bravery. The sources lay out specific interlocking factors. Let's really dive into these three pillars of the Ottoman victory.
Right, because these pillars move the analysis beyond individual heroism, and they demonstrate this excellent premeditated defensive strategy that exploited every single Allied weakness.
Okay, pillar one is all about mastery of the battle space, defense and terrain. The Ottomans made highly effective use of the terrain and, crucially, something military historians call interior lines. What are interior lines and why do they matter so much here?
So interior lines refers to the logistical advantage of moving forces along shorter, safer routes inside a central position to reinforce threatened points on the perimeter. The Gallipoli Peninsula is long and narrow.
Okay.
The Allies, landing at separate beachheads like Helles and ANZAC, had to move outside this landmass to reinforce each other, often relying on slow, exposed naval transport under fire.
Whereas the Ottomans were moving freely and quickly on their own ground, shielded from the fleet.
Precisely. Moving along these safer, quicker interior lines, the defenders could concentrate their forces much faster against a vulnerable landing zone than the Allies could reinforce their forward positions. This tactical speed allowed them to seal off every beachhead before a breakthrough could happen.
So that's pillar one. Pillar two is how they neutralized the massive advantage the Allies thought they had. Fortifications, the coastal defenses, the artillery, and those infamous minefields.
This is a perfect example of static defense, just completely nullifying overwhelming firepower. The fixed defenses forced the Allies to commit to a ground campaign they were totally unprepared for.
And the mines and guns kept the big battleships at bay.
Crucially, yes. It prevented that overwhelming Allied naval superiority from being applied directly against the land forces. By forcing the fight onto the scrubland, the Ottomans basically stripped the Allies of their main advantage, their technologically superior fleet.
And then there's Pillar 3, which is often the most frustrating element of any military defeat. Allied errors and hesitation. This wasn't just bad luck.
No, not at all. This was poor planning compounded by poor execution.
What were the biggest failures?
Well, the sources highlight several. First, a gross underestimation of Ottoman resilience. They saw them as a soft target, which is a fatal flaw. Second, the objectives were just impossible given the resources they committed. But the most tactically damaging failure was the hesitation, the lack of decisive exploitation once they did gain a foothold.
And we have a key example of that, right? At Suvla Bay.
The perfect illustration. In August 1915, a new landing was conducted at Suvla Bay. It presented a genuine opportunity for a breakout, a tactical surprise. But the Allied command was hesitant, slow to push inland.
Instead of immediately seizing the commanding heights,
They paused. They paused to consolidate. And that pause was fatal.
it allowed the Ottomans to do what they did best.
It bought them invaluable time. They rushed reserves along those interior lines, closed the ring, and solidified their defense positions. That failure to seize the moment at Suvla Bay really sealed the campaign's eventual failure. By January 1916, the entire Allied force was evacuated.
A total failure. And if we connect that failure to the bigger picture, the consequences were seismic, extending far beyond the fighting. The costs alone were staggering.
The human cost was immense. Both sides suffered massive casualties. While the numbers vary, overall losses killed, wounded, missing were roughly comparable, hundreds of thousands combined.
But the key fact is that the Entente achieved nothing.
Nothing. No decisive breakthrough whatsoever, making their losses, from a strategic point of view, entirely in vain.
And on the Allied side, a failure of this magnitude always requires a political scapegoat. Who paid the price?
The defeat badly damaged the standing of every leader who championed the campaign. But the most prominent political casualty was Winston Churchill.
Of course.
As First Lord of the Admiralty, he was the principal architect of the whole strategy. The political fallout was so severe he was forced to resign from the cabinet. He even spent time in political exile, briefly serving on the Western Front. It was a career-defining humiliation.
And yet, on the other side of the coin, that same strategic failure fed directly into some of the most potent national narratives of the 20th century.
Exactly. For the Ottoman forces, the victory was a massive boost to morale. This hard-fought defense against the world's great powers. It provided a foundational success story of resilience.
It fed directly into Turkish national mythology.
It became a psychological proof point of national capability that future leaders, like Kemal, would build upon.
And at the same time, across the globe, Gallipoli created the distinct and enduring legacy of the ANZAC forces, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps.
Right. A tactical defeat became the ultimate crucible for those young nations. It's a remarkable cultural phenomenon.
How so?
Their sacrifice, the shared adversity in the crucible of Gallipoli, fighting and dying so far from home. It became the moment those nations felt they stepped out from under the shadow of the British Empire and developed their own unique character.
And ANZAC Day is still the single most important annual commemoration in both countries.
Without a doubt.
So we have this one single battle that simultaneously generates a founding victory myth for the defenders, Turkey, and a crucial origin story for the national identity of the invading forces, Australia and New Zealand.
That's where this deep dive really pays off, I think. It's a battle defined by strategic miscalculation on one side, met with extraordinary resilience and tactical brilliance on the other. It transformed a military defeat for the Allies into this profound political and national genesis for both the defenders and their former colonial troops.
So as a final thought then, what's so fascinating here is how one military failure simultaneously became a founding myth for three separate modern nations. And this raises a really important question for you to consider when you're studying conflicts. How often does the immediate military outcome, who won and who lost the trenches, how often does that mask the true long-term political and identity-forming impacts of the war?
Indeed. We'd encourage you to think about how these potent national narratives forged in the unforgiving trenches and scrubland of Gallipoli over a century ago continue to influence international relations and cultural memory today. That's something worth thinking about long after this deep dive is over.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a whole stack of source material. We've got memoirs, military history, some really granular tactical reports, and we're diving into one of the most pivotal military decisions of the First World War.
It's a huge one.
We're looking at a moment where a single commander, under just immense fire and facing total chaos, decides to ignore his orders and just trust his gut.
And in doing so, he basically creates the origin story of a nation builder. We're deep diving into the 1915 Gallipoli campaign, and we're focusing right in on Mustafa Kemal.
The man who would become Atatürk.
Exactly. Specifically, his actions as commander of the 19th Division during those first Allied landings.
Right. So our mission here is to really extract the details of his decisions on that one day, April 25th, 1915. We want to see how his, tactical genius, or maybe just his brilliant high-stakes gambling.
It's a bit of both.
How that transformed just a desperate defensive situation into this decisive, history-altering victory. We're really talking about that thin line between military failure and political destiny.
That's absolutely the core of it. Because when you read the reports from that morning, you realize the entire defense of the Dardanelles was hanging by a thread.
Just a thread.
The Ottoman High Command was expecting the main Allied invasion to hit much further south, near the tip of the peninsula.
So Kemal's division was, in reserve?
Just held in reserve, waiting.
Okay, let's unpack this. This initial miscalculation seems critical. Why did the Ottoman leadership believe the landings at Ari Burnu, what the Allies called ANZAC Cove, was just a diversion? A feint.
It was a simple assumption, really, but a catastrophic one. It was all based on geography. The Dardanelles Straits, that's the ultimate prize, right?
Right.
And they're closest to the lower tip of the peninsula. So logically, you think, well, the main force is going to land there. Ari Burnu was way further north, and the terrain was just awful. Much tougher.
So they see the reports and just dismiss them?
Immediately. Central Command classifies it as a secondary maneuver, a distraction.
But Kemal didn't see it that way.
No, not at all. And that is the first massive insight these sources deliver. Kemal recognized the sheer scale of it, the strategic importance of that spot, almost instantly.
So he knew.
He knew that if the Allies, the ANZAC forces in this case, if they managed to secure that central high ground, they just cut the peninsula in half. The whole southern defense would be, irrelevant.
So he had to act on his own?
He had to act independently, yeah. He had to ignore the cautious, wait and see positioning of his superiors.
You're saying he just fundamentally disagreed with the entire strategic assessment, and instead of waiting for confirmation, he just moved his forces.
Precisely. And you have to look at the speed of it. He was miles away from the actual landing zone. When the reports started trickling in about ANZAC's moving inland, he immediately redirected key units.
Without approval.
He didn't wait for his commanding general, Lehman von Sanders, to approve it. That would take hours. And those hours, that was the difference between containment and complete catastrophe.
And this brings us back to the geography you mentioned. It wasn't just a guess. He knew that terrain.
What's fascinating here is it's the immediate connection between his prior knowledge of the ground and his success on the battlefield. He knew that peninsula inside and out from his time during the Balkan Wars.
So he'd been there before.
He had literally walked it, studied it. He knew that ridgeline, Chinook Bear, wasn't just some hill. It was the geographical linchpin, the highest point overlooking everything. Whoever holds that ridge
controls the entire game.
Controls the entire middle of the peninsula. Simple as that.
So he wasn't just reacting to the enemy landing, he was actually racing them to a destination he already knew was critical.
It was a desperate race uphill. And he personally led the charge with his 57th Regiment. You have to try and picture it.
Yeah.
You've got the ANZAC troops, they're disorganized because they landed in the wrong spot, struggling through these ravines and scrub, trying to get up to those ridges. And Kemal's forces are racing up the other side of the slope. If the ANZACs get there first,
it's over. The campaign is lost.
On day one, it's over.
And the sources confirm he got there just in the nick of time?
Oh, just. They basically collided on the ridge. The 57th Regiment arrives on Chinook Bear literally as the Allied advance parties are sighting the crest.
Wow.
And Kemal's immediate aggressive deployment just pinned them down. That single maneuver, that timely arrival, prevented the breakout and stabilized the whole line.
So the speed of his deployment saved the line. But saving it came at a cost that is almost, it's unimaginable. Let's move from that initial tactical success to the sheer determination required for his most famous command.
This is the moment, the defining moment of the day, maybe of his entire career. The 57th Regiment, having just made it to the high ground, they're exhausted, they're facing fresh Allied reserves coming up the hill.
And they were running out of ammunition.
Running out of ammo, getting pushed back, the line was about to crumble.
And this is the point where, any other commander would have ordered a managed retreat, maybe. or waited for support.
Right. But Kemal issues an order that it just defies conventional military logic.
This is the order that defines him.
It absolutely is. He walked up to the remnants of the 57th Regiment and he gave the command. And we have the exact quote delivered right in the face of what looked like certain defeat. He said, "I don't order you to attack, I order you to die."
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because how do we even analyze that? It sounds like pure desperation, but you're saying it was a calculation.
It was absolutely a calculation. It was a calculation of time versus existence. The goal of that brutally simple command wasn't to win the battle right there and then.
What was it then?
It was explicitly meant to buy time. Maybe 6, maybe 8 critical hours. Just enough time for the rest of the 19th Division and other scattered reserves to move into new defensive positions further back.
So the goal was simple. Use the bodies of the 57th Regiment as a temporary wall, an immovable obstacle.
That's the hard truth of it. The order was simple, it was violent, and it was absolute. Hold this ground until you are all gone. And in doing so, you will stall the enemy's momentum.
And it worked.
It worked. The sacrifice of the 57th Regiment, which was, it was virtually annihilated. It bought the time they needed. The Allied forces just stopped in their tracks by this extreme resistance. They paused to regroup, and they missed their window.
They missed their chance to break out inland on April 25th.
That was their one shot, and it was gone.
It's just hard to imagine the ethical weight of that. Securing national survival at the cost of your entire unit.
But the result was undeniable.
Yeah.
That line held. The sacrifice forced the Allies into this narrow, contained beachhead.
And that transformed what should have been a mobile advance into brutal, static trench warfare. It was the pivot point of the whole campaign.
Yeah.
If that line had broken,
Constantinople would have been threatened.
Gallipoli would have been an Allied victory within a month. The war could have looked very different.
Okay, let's shift focus a bit. Let's move from that single chaotic day to the broader campaign. And, maybe more importantly, to the legacy this action created. Because Kemal's leadership wasn't just a one-off charge. Oh, far from it. That first day established him as the most dynamic, the most effective commander the Ottomans had on the entire peninsula. He didn't just contain the beachheads, he masterminded the defense against the huge, renewed Allied attacks later that summer.
Right, let's talk about the August offensives. The new landings at Suvla Bay. The Allies tried again to break the deadlock, and they failed again.
They tried to outflank ANZAC entirely, land new forces further north at Suvla, hoping they could just sweep down and roll up the Ottoman defenses. The thinking was that the Ottomans were too fixated on the ANZAC line.
And what did Kemal do?
He was absolutely instrumental in repulsing that new threat. He showed strategic foresight, not just reaction. And even though he was still just a divisional commander, they gave him responsibility for the whole area.
So he was taking on a bigger role.
A much bigger role. He aggressively used his limited reserves to counterattack at Suvla and also on the renewed assault on Chunuk Bair. And he often had to overrule the more cautious advice from senior commanders.
Including the German generals.
Yes, including them. He basically took the scattered, exhausted Ottoman defense and turned it into this flexible, resilient, counterattacking force that could hit the Allies at every point of vulnerability.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, his repeated successes were just, a masterclass in operational command.
Absolutely. He stopped the breakout at ANZAC in April. Then he stopped the flanking maneuver at Suvla in August. His leadership directly led to the containment that forced the Allied evacuation by early 1916.
And that victory at Gallipoli, which was, let's be honest, a rare success for the Central Powers at that time, it must have had enormous domestic implications.
Huge. The victory became a massive propaganda tool, a much-needed shot of national morale. And even though the empire eventually fractured and fell, Gallipoli proved that the Turkish soldier, when led decisively, could defeat the best armies in Europe.
And the man who got the credit for that decisive leadership was Mustafa Kemal.
He was the face of the victory. The man willing to demand death to save a battle had shown he had the focus and decisiveness to, eventually, to save and redefine a whole nation.
The sources really make this connection powerfully, don't they? His success at Gallipoli, his ability to overrule high command and be right, it laid the groundwork for his entire political future.
It's the absolute critical groundwork. When the empire collapsed after the war, he had the credibility, he had the national fame and the military authority that he earned right there at Gallipoli to step forward and lead the Turkish War of Independence.
So Gallipoli wasn't just a battle for him, it was his political platform. It's where he earned the unwavering trust of his men and the hero status that defined the next decade as he built the modern Republic of Turkey.
And became Atatürk.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? This deep dive really shows us the power of decisive, informed leadership under the most intense pressure imaginable. Kemal's quick recognition of the threat at Ari Burna, a threat his superiors completely missed,
Right.
and his willingness to demand the ultimate sacrifice from the 57th at Suvla Bay. These were decisions made in minutes based on prior knowledge that determined the fate of a campaign and ultimately launched the career of a nation's founder.
It's a classic case study in what you might call operational improvisation. He used his geographical knowledge to pick the right terrain, he acted with total autonomy when others were hesitating, and he issued a command of just, absolute finality to buy time. Those three things save the day.
The larger lesson here seems to be that in moments of extreme crisis, clarity, a clarity that's rooted in preparation and knowledge, it often trumps conventional hierarchy. You have to know your Chinook Bear, that single vital piece of high ground you have to secure, no matter the cost, to win the longer game.
And that leads us to our final provocative thought for you. The sources show a military commander whose tactical decisions didn't just save a battle, they forged the reputation he needed to build a nation from the ashes of an empire. So consider this. How often does a political future and the fate of millions hang entirely on the razor's edge of one specific high-stakes battlefield decision? A decision made not by a committee, but by one person in the first few chaotic hours of a conflict. That moment on April 25th, 1915, didn't just preserve a defense, it created the platform for a revolution.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking a deep plunge into one of history's most ambitious and I think most tragic military campaigns. Gallipoli, 1915.
It's an absolutely fascinating and devastating story.
It really is. And this operation, sometimes called the Dardanelles campaign, wasn't just another front in the First World War. It was meant to be a strategic masterstroke.
The war winner, really. That was the thinking.
Exactly. The idea, championed mostly by Winston Churchill at the time, was to use overwhelming naval power and a huge ground invasion to seize the Dardanelles Straits.
And if they could do that, the path was open.
Right. The goal was to sail straight through to Istanbul, knock the Ottoman Empire completely out of the war, and maybe just as importantly, open up a supply route to their Russian allies.
The stakes were just immense. If it worked, it could have shortened the war by years.
Years. Okay, so let's unpack this. We've been given sources that detail this incredibly audacious plan and, of course, its eventual horrifying collapse. Our mission here, for you, the listener, is to go beyond the casualty numbers and really zero in on the exact cascade of failures that turned this supposedly decisive operation into a grueling, bloody stalemate.
And what's so interesting here is that it wasn't one single mistake. It wasn't one bad call that doomed the whole thing.
No.
It was more like a perfect storm. It was where every single point of failure, from the planning on a map table thousands of miles away to the chaos on the beaches themselves, all converged at once.
So we're looking at this not just as a military defeat, but as a failure of leadership to really synthesize the intelligence they had and adapt to the reality on the ground.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. The initial landings on April 25th, 1915. This was a massive, massive undertaking.
It was huge.
You had two main efforts trying to secure crucial territory. Down in the south, you had the British forces, and they were focused on the Cape Helles beaches, with the objective of fighting inland toward the heights of a place called Achi Baba.
And then just up the coast, you have the ANZAC, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps.
Yeah.
And they arguably had the toughest job of all.
Right. Their target was the area around Gallipoli, or Ari Burna.
And their mission was incredibly aggressive. The whole idea was to push and push fast right across the peninsula, seize the Sari Bear mountain range, and cut those vital Ottoman supply lines that ran north to south.
So it was all about speed, high risk.
Entirely reliant on momentum. If they lost that initial momentum, the whole plan was in jeopardy.
And that's pretty much where the chaos started, almost instantly. You talk about momentum, but it seems like environmental factors and just poor execution completely wrecked the plan before the defenders even had to fire a shot.
Well, they were fighting the ocean before they were fighting the enemy. The sources we have show that strong, totally unexpected currents just created absolute havoc with their navigation.
And that leads to probably the most famous and maybe the most critical error of the entire campaign.
The ANZACs completely missed their landing spot.
By a lot, right? Something like 1.5 kilometers north.
Exactly, 1.5 kilometers. And in that landscape, that small distance might as well have been 100 miles. It made all the difference.
Because instead of landing on a relatively open beach,
they were thrown into what the soldiers immediately called the maze. I mean, it was this nightmarish, steep, difficult ground full of deep ravines and covered in this dense, thorny scrub.
Wow. So that single navigation error just turns the entire mission on its head.
Instantly. The plan for a rapid advance over the Sari Bear Range just evaporated. It became a desperate, confused fight for survival, with troops bogged down in these gullies, just trying to stay alive under withering fire.
So let's talk about that terrain. Why was it such a decisive factor? It seems like it was just perfectly suited for the defenders.
It really was. The materials we looked at paint this picture of relentlessly steep ravines, hills covered in scrub that offered zero cover for attackers, but perfect concealment for defenders, and critically, it was waterless.
So if you can picture this, the listener, the Ottomans basically had the high ground everywhere. They were looking down on every single Allied advance.
Precisely. Every push forward became this grueling, exposed climb straight into the enemy's guns.
And that allowed for something called enfilade fire, right?
Yes, and that is absolutely devastating. To be clear for you, the listener, that means the defenders aren't just shooting at the front of an attacking line. They're positioned to shoot down the entire length of it from the side.
Just mowing them down horizontally.
Essentially, yes. The geography itself created these natural killing zones. It made that rapid advance they needed for success physically impossible.
So really, within hours of the first boats hitting the beach, the main strategic goal of a quick breakout was already dead.
Completely dead.
Yeah.
The campaign devolved almost immediately into this bloody, static trench warfare. The very thing they were trying to avoid, the thing that was happening on the Western Front.
They were just stuck on these tiny, precarious beachheads, losing men by the thousand and gaining almost no ground.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the Allied command realized they couldn't just keep feeding men into this meat grinder. By late summer, they knew they needed a huge, bold move to break the deadlock.
And this leads to the August offensive.
The big gamble.
A last-ditch attempt to flank the Ottoman defenses with a whole new wave of troops. So tell us about the plan for Suvla Bay.
The plan on paper was actually pretty sound. The British IX Corps was tasked with a night landing at Suvla Bay. This was on the 6th and 7th of August.
The idea being a huge envelopment, a flanking move.
Exactly. Flank them, seize the key ground behind them, and relieve the exhausted ANZACs who were, at the same time, trying to break out further south at places like Lone Pine.
So the objective for these fresh troops at Suvla was to grab the Anafarta Heights and link up with the ANZACs. The idea was to sort of squeeze the Ottoman defenders between two forces.
And here's the absolute crushing irony of the whole campaign. The initial landing at Suvla Bay, it worked.
It was successful?
Yes. Initial opposition was really light. They secured the beachhead with relatively few casualties. This was the golden opportunity. The enemy's flank was exposed. The door was wide open.
But leadership hesitated to walk through it, and this is where we see the command failures really start to compound the problem, turning a setback into a complete disaster.
It's just heartbreaking to read about. The troops are on the beach, ready to go, but instead of aggressively pushing inland to those critical, lightly defended heights, the commanders just delayed.
That delay was fatal, wasn't it?
Absolutely fatal. The material we looked at paints this damning picture of the generals in charge, people like Stockford, just completely failing to grasp the urgency of the moment. They were more worried about setting up supply dumps and reorganizing their men.
And we're talking about an astonishing delay here. The sources confirm the troops at Suvla waited for 48 hours.
48 hours.
2 full days before making a serious push inland. That's an eternity when momentum is the only thing you have.
It is. It's like they were struck by a kind of tactical paralysis. They achieved their first limited objective, get on the beach, and then they just froze. Maybe they were too cautious, thinking of the casualties on the Western Front.
But that lost initiative was just a gift to the Ottomans.
The biggest gift they could have asked for. It gave them all the time they needed to rush in reinforcements, dig in on those Anafarta Heights, and slam the door shut. The whole August offensive failed before it ever really began.
So that delay at Suvla really brings us to the core of this deep dive. We've seen the story unfold, the misdrops, the terrible terrain, the paralysis. But now we need to zoom out and look at the systemic reasons for why it all failed. It wasn't just bad luck on the day, was it?
Not at all. It was a complete systemic breakdown across 4, I'd say, interconnected areas. And if you understand these 4 points, you really understand why Gallipoli collapsed.
Okay, so what's the first one?
The first is just fundamentally poor planning that was rooted in abysmal intelligence. The Allies severely underestimated the fighting quality and, just as importantly, the sheer number of Ottoman defenders.
The whole plan was based on them facing a disorganized, weak enemy.
Exactly. But the reality was completely different. They were expecting to have superior numbers, but when they landed, they were facing 6 full Ottoman divisions with only 5 of their own.
So they didn't even have numerical superiority at the key points of attack.
No. And their logistical planning was, if anything, even worse.
In what way?
Well, there was a desperate lack of accurate maps. You can't fight a precision campaign if you don't actually know the contours of the ground you're fighting on.
Right.
But even more basic than that, there was a complete failure to identify and plan to secure water sources. This is a hot, dry, waterless landscape. The troops were literally dehydrating as they were fighting, which just crippled their ability to advance.
That physical breakdown, the heat, the thirst, the terrain, that just amplifies the second point of failure, which is that command hesitancy you mentioned.
It's all connected. We already talked about the 48-hour delay at Suvla, but that wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern of behavior.
Limited objectives.
Consistently. They would push to secure a beachhead and then just stop, feeling like they'd done their job for the day. They failed to drive inland toward the actual strategic objectives, and they never synchronized their attacks, which meant the Ottomans could just deal with one threat at a time.
It almost sounds like they were so afraid of repeating the carnage of the Western Front that they refused to take the aggressive risks needed for a breakthrough.
And in the end, they got all the carnage anyway, just without the breakthrough. A terrible irony. Which brings us to the third point, and this one is really a credit to the enemy. The highly effective Ottoman resistance.
We have to acknowledge they were facing a very capable foe.
They absolutely were. The Ottoman forces used their superior interior lines, which just means they could move troops and supplies across the short width of the peninsula much faster than the Allies could sail them around the coast.
And their counterattacks were devastating.
Vicious. But the single most important factor on their side was a commander named Mustafa Kemal.
Who would later become Atatürk, the founder of modern Turkey.
The very same. His quick, decisive actions, especially after that initial ANZAC misdrop, rushing up reinforcements, seizing the critical high ground himself, that completely neutralized any chance of an early Allied success. Where the Allied commanders were hesitant and slow, Kemal was bold and fast.
So what's the fourth key factor then? We've got bad intelligence, hesitant command, and a strong enemy.
The fourth is the bigger strategic mistake of not properly synchronizing the naval and land attacks. The initial naval bombardment, which was supposed to destroy the Ottoman defenses, it really failed to neutralize their mobile artillery.
So when the troops landed,
they were immediately under heavy fire from well-sighted, well-defended artillery positions that should have been taken out by the Navy.
So if we bring this all together for you, the listener, what does it all mean? The lesson of Gallipoli isn't one simple mistake. It's a textbook case of a total cascade of systemic failure.
That's right. Poor intelligence was magnified by the debilitating terrain, and that was then finalized by fatally hesitant leadership at the key moments.
The plan needed precision and speed, but all it got was confusion and delay.
Our deep dive really confirms that the failure here was comprehensive. It wasn't bad luck, it was bad planning, geographical misjudgment, huge intelligence gaps, and a crippling lack of initiative, especially during that 48-hour pause at Suvla Bay. That moment sealed the campaign's fate.
And the human cost of that failure is just. It's the devastating legacy of Gallipoli. The source material makes it so clear what happens when commanders, maybe fearing risk, set limited goals and hesitate to exploit success.
It really highlights a timeless military truth.
Yeah.
Momentum is often the most precious and the most perishable resource you have.
So here's a final provocative thought for you to consider. If the entire outcome of this massive campaign, a campaign designed to change the very course of the war, could really hang on a single 48-hour delay, what other historical events show us that seizing initiative, that creating momentum, is often more crucial than having more men or more guns? Perhaps the real tragedy of Gallipoli is that failure wasn't inevitable, it was chosen.